So one of my favorite things about the Fuji x100v is how gorgeous the images are. The color is phenomenal. It's just so fun to work with. And one of my favorite things to do is shoot in RAW, bring it into Lightroom, throw on some music, and just go through and edit all my photos. Photography for me is such a creative break from the filmmaking process. It allows me to fully just step back and rest from what I do for work. And though it's still in the same kind of sphere, photography is just such a fun thing for me to do, and shooting in RAW allows me to enjoy that whole process and see all my photos come to fruition. Fuji is well known for their JPEGs, which for someone who came from Canon and Sony, I never really shot in JPEG, so it's kind of a weird switch for me, but Fuji's JPEGs are phenomenal, and there's a website called Fuji X Weekly that has all these custom pre-built recipes that you can install into your camera, and now you have 7 film stocks in the palm of your hands. Lately, I've been trying out shooting in JPEG, but it really hasn't been doing much for me. I still am drawn back towards that shooting in RAW process, throwing it into Lightroom and choosing the camera profile that I want. So shooting in JPEG is a little niche. It's easy if you don't want to edit your photos, but for me, I just still love shooting in RAW. So today I want to walk you guys through my entire process on how I edit these Fuji photos. Everything I'm showing you today was shot in RAW, no filters, no nothing, just straight out of camera RAW, and my process is pretty minimal. You may have seen my filmmaking stuff, my color grading, my work that I put out. Everything's pretty natural and minimal. And for me, the idea of less is more really comes out in my entire process. So today we'll be inside of Lightroom CC. I was in Lightroom Classic for the longest time, but going down to the mobile version of Lightroom on desktop has allowed me to treat photography as like a hobby instead of treating it as work. So yeah, let's get into Lightroom. So all these photos you see here are some of my favorite photos that I've taken while owning the Fuji x100v. But yeah, we'll be going through this. It's a super minimal and quick process that is just pretty much rinse and repeat throughout all my photos. Okay, so starting off, when you shoot in RAW, you have access to these camera profiles. Yeah, you can still use them with JPEGs, but since JPEGs have their look baked in, it's not really the same. So essentially you go to camera profile, go up to browse all profiles, you go down to camera matching, and then now you have all of these profiles that Fuji gives you. And these are what the film simulations, like the recipes, are all built off of. So for me, I don't really have like a one size fits all camera profile, but for the most part, I switch between Astia, Classic Chrome, Acros, Monochrome, and lately I've been using Velvia. Velvia has such a fun look to it depending on the lighting and in the scene. It's definitely not a one size fits all kind of camera profile, but it's been really fun for me to mess about with it as of late. So first things first, I always do the same things. I will go through, choose my camera profile. So for this one, I think going to Velvia makes sense. And then for every photo that I do, it's 5x4. And then before we go further into all of the sliders and the HSL and everything, I'm just gonna go down, go to sharpening, bring it to 20, go to grain, bring it up to 25 or 30, and then we're going to do choose edit settings to copy. And then we'll just do effects, detail, optics, and crop. So now, if I go through every photo, I can copy and paste those foundational settings. This allows me to have the base of the grain and the sharpening, which is kind of annoying to switch between every single photo. The crop is easy because if you paste it and you do the crop tool, you can easily adjust it. Whereas grain and sharpening gets to be a little too much to try to change between every single photo. But anyways, we're on this photo here. Just gonna start with the crop tool, and then let's go down into our sliders here. So I kind of want to make this a little flatter. I want to try to make it like a little vintage looking. So with the sliders, I always go back and forth. You'll see me do this on every single photo. It's always nice to see like the extremes, like how far you can go on either side. So you kind of like pull it past like a good point, and then you can bring it back. So then you know exactly where it needs to be. Let's go down to the tone curve. Let's bring that back up. And then one of my favorite things to do while I'm editing photos is to use the before and after keystroke. It just allows me to see how far the photo has come, and then you can see the original that you captured in camera. And the biggest tip that I have for photography is to shoot everything in camera as close to perfect as possible. You don't want to have anything be super overexposed knowing that you're going to bring it down. Of course you can do that with these raw files. They have so much latitude, but for me, I really value having everything be as close to perfect, and you can kind of dial in your look, and it shouldn't take as much time as if you underexpose or overexpose an image. So I like to keep things minimal and natural and that helps out a ton. Okay, so with white balance, I usually just cycle through to see if any of these presets work for me. Sometimes auto looks good, but then you can kind of tone it back. Let's go back to as shot. This is looking a little too yellow. So now we have yellow in these hills here. I want to desat that and then kind of keep the luminance the same. If I bring the luminance down or up, you get this like weird line across like the sky here. So I really don't like that. So I want to keep that looking natural. And then for the sky, let's add saturation and then add lightness. Add a little bit of luminance there. So that's before and after. It's looking good. Got orange here. Yeah, I really like this image so far. Let's see if we can bring the exposure up a tiny bit. Bring the contrast. It's all fine tuning with photo editing. You just go back and forth between each of these. Okay. Kind of warm that up a little bit after seeing that. And then because I'm editing with a window in front of me, kind of have to block out the light. Yeah, I really like that image. Super quick and easy. Use the Astia color profile. So there's before, there's after. Pretty happy with that one. Okay, on to the next one. So we already pasted the foundation settings here. And let's adjust the crop. You can see it's pretty underexposed, but the highlights are all pretty blown out. You can see it in the histogram up here how much detail is up there. But don't you worry, we could definitely pull out a lot of detail with this. So let's add some exposure, drop contrast, drop highlights, and you can see how much detail is retained in that upper end. And then if you look up here in the histogram, if you click these little triangles, you can see what's being overexposed or underexposed. So that's like a fun little tool as well if you don't really know how to read a histogram. But I don't really use it that much. But I still want these highlights to be pretty bright because that's how it was in person. Just like how I color grade for video, I like to keep things as close to natural as possible. So if it looked like that in person, I try to mimic that in post and try to make it look better than it did in person, but I don't want it to be super stylized. So already with just the sliders and the tone curve, it looks so much better. And then because this is like a cabin interior, if we do auto, there's so much orange in here that the auto makes it pretty blue, but I don't want it to be blue. I want it to be a little bit warmer. So with just that white balance adjustment, it just feels way more inviting. If anything, we can like crop down a bit just so we see this scene, which I actually like way more. Let's run with that. Okay, down to the HSL. I'm just gonna pull out a little bit of yellow. You can see it right here in the pillows. I don't want too much yellow there, but I also don't want it to be like blue and white. Add a little bit of orange and then lighten that up. So with the HSLs, you can see those adjustments there. For the color grading, like little 3 color wheel thing, I never really touch this. You can kind of get crazy with it a bit, like if you want to put some blue in the highlights and shadows of the orange. I usually do that or flip it, but it becomes pretty stylized and like I don't really like that too much, so I never really use that. And then grain looks good, sharpening looks good. Yeah, I'm happy with this one. Super easy. We're able to save so much detail out of this one. So yeah, there's before, there's after. Pretty stoked on that one. Now this one was a little slow shutter, just fun camera drag movement, but I want this one to be grungy. So I shot this in color in RAW, knowing that I wanted to make it black and white and feel pretty gritty. So with this, we're gonna go a little bit different than what I normally do. So we're gonna go to, where is it? I want monochrome, yeah. I don't want Adobe monochrome, I want the actual Fuji monochrome. There it is, okay. I'm gonna crank that contrast, drop exposure a tiny bit, highlights up, shadows down. I love embracing the shadows. I don't really like having like all my shadows be like full of detail. I like having them pretty dark and punchy. We're gonna do a classic S curve on this. Just gives it like a nice roll off. Then we're gonna add some more grain to this just to make it feel more gritty, and then we're gonna add some texture. I like adding texture. I don't really like adding clarity. I feel like texture puts it in the right spots, and then clarity just like destroys the whole image. So I just like doing texture for these. So yeah, this was super quick and easy. Nice little punchy black and white image. You have bright highlights, dark shadows, and a bunch of grain. So yeah, love the grain texture on this. There's before, there's after. Love that. Okay, so let's copy these settings again. I'm just gonna paste these on all of these here. So I just pasted all of these settings across the board. So now we can have the right amount of grain, and the crop is all 5x4, 4x5, and we can run with it there. Okay, so I think for this, I wanna do classic chrome and make it brighter. And I know I wanna make this warmer. I know it's like a winter shot, but I want this to feel like inviting. So just gonna bring those highlights down and then make those shadows a bit darker. Yeah, I'm loving the look of this so far. And with snowy scenes, I like adding contrast. It just makes the highlights and the snow feel punchier. It makes it feel like it's like actually white. If I go low in the contrast, everything just kind of feels a little separated, but I actually do like low contrast with this, but you know, it all just depends. But we definitely will bring those highlights down a bit so you can see more detail in the street here. You can see there's just so much detail in these raw files. It's so much fun. Okay, I do like that crop. Let's add a little bit more warmth. You can see how much that white balance adjusts the image. Okay, now I'm looking at the house in the back. It's like super blue. So I'm just gonna bring the luminance up and then the saturation up, just to make it feel a bit lighter. And then I love this orange, like brown fence in the foreground. So I want that to feel a bit more saturated too. Yeah, I really like that. Quick and dirty. So there's before, there's after. Love that look. I love shooting raw in the snow. I feel like when you shoot snowy scenes, like the light just gets so nice. It's just so fun for me to edit. Okay, now we have this one. So when I took this photo, I knew I wanted to crop in on this. The camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, so it's not really like the biggest for cropping, but you can definitely get away with a little bit. So I knew I wanted this main section to be cropped down. So right now I'm looking at this little line where like the mud kind of stops, and I want to crop this down, just showing all that texture. We'll do the same thing here. Go to camera monochrome, just make it super punchy. I don't want those highlights to be like super bright. I want them to feel like a little gray. So we'll bring those highlights down, shadows down. I just love that little tone curve there. It keeps the midtones where it needs to be, the shadows get darker, and then the highlights get a little bit softer so they're not as white. Let's add some more grain, add some texture. Contrast is way up. Let's bring the exposure up a tiny bit. Yeah, love that right there. So there's before, there's after, and then when you take a look at the crop here, like you could see how the image looks so different once you crop it in. So cropping is definitely an easy way to elevate your image. Every time I'm shooting photos, I'm always like trying to think of like how I'm gonna crop it down. But I love the 5x4 crop with this. And yeah, I just love these little textures here. Okay, so now we have another Death Valley scene. So I'm just gonna copy these settings. And when I do choose edit settings to copy, I'll just do all of them. And then we might have to tweak things as we go on, because it might not be a 1-for-1. So paste that in. That's done. I would exactly edit it like that. I love how like soft these hills are. I love the blue in the sky, how it's like nice and soft and pastel. Exposure looks good. We'll call it that. So there's before, there's after, one and done. So that's the nice thing about shooting in RAW and building presets out of that. If you have the same scene and the same lighting, you can copy and paste settings and then just tweak a little bit where you need to. But yeah, that turned out really great. And one thing you might notice is that I don't really use the radial or linear gradients or spot healing or anything. I just like editing colors, doing cropping, adjusting the exposure a bit, adding grain, and calling it good. I don't really like going in and like taking people out or making gradients and stuff. I just like keeping things simple. So now for this scene, I'm going to adjust the crop a bit. I want that to be kind of running through from right to left through the scene with the middle of the trail in the middle here. And you can see that the horizon line isn't straight. I used to adjust everything to be straight. It just feels a little bit more intimate and raw if your horizon lines aren't straight. So I don't really care about that anymore. Okay, let's do classic chrome. Let's do a little speed around with this. So I'm constantly looking at the image, looking at the histogram, seeing how these sliders are adjusting it. And yeah, it's looking good so far. It's looking a little contrasty. But yeah, just constantly looking back at the histogram, at the image, seeing how things are moving around and if it's going in the right direction. If it is, I keep going with it, run with it, and keep adjusting. Just a minimal process for me. I want to add more warmth. Let's add a bit more grain. Feels like the scene needs some more grain. And then I'm not really liking the contrast here, so let's look at the different profiles. Ooh, classic neg looks fun. Let's try this one out. Adds a little bit more green in the shadows, it looks like. But I'm going to drop that contrast in the highlights. Keep shadows up. Whites will be normal. And we'll have to overcompensate with the temperature there just because it feels a little too cool with the greens and the shadows. So there's before, there's after. Just feels nice and vintage. Really like that. So with this, let's edit this one from scratch. I want this to feel nice and warm. Sunset time. So I think if we do Astia, this will look pretty good. So because the scene's a little too hot up here, I'm just going to drop the exposure. Drop contrast a bit. Highlights, shadows. Already with just the light and the tone curve, you can do so much with that. Just going to reset the exposure now that we've done those adjustments. White balance as shot looks good, but let's just bring it to be a little bit warmer. And then we could bring the saturation down in the yellow and the orange just so it doesn't feel as overbearing. Get up the lightness too. Yeah, love where this is at. Quick and dirty. So there's before, there's after. Just balancing out all those tones there. Now we got one from Mammoth. I love snowy weather with sunlight. It always just looks so good. So I think for this I want Astia again. Astia's kind of been my go-to lately. It just feels so nice. You got enough saturation. It's nice and soft. It's just a really good base to start off on. We'll go down, do our normal thing. Auto white balance, you can see how that gets adjusted. I don't really like how orange that is, but we could dial it back. Love where that's at. I see there's a little bit too much blue, so I'll desat it a bit. Up the luminance just to kind of soften it up. A little too much yellow in the scene. Highlights are looking good there. I don't want them to be like super down. Shadows, I usually never bring them up, but for right now, I think this looks pretty good there. And then I just want to add like 40 grain just to give it like a bit more texture. And we can make the grain bigger. If you look at the grain here, if you go small, it looks a little weird, but if you go big, it kind of feels more like a painting. So let's do that. Let's actually bring that shadows down. So I'm seeing a little bit of purple in her beanie here, and I hate purple in my scenes. So I'm just gonna desat those and then just darken them because I don't really need them. Seeing purple like more, or whatever you want to call it, is not my favorite. Okay, so there's before, there's after. Love, love, love how that looks. So we'll copy the settings from Melissa in Convict Lake, paste them over just because the scenes seem a little bit similar. Done. I don't even want to touch that. I love where everything's at with this. You got a little bit that's clipping in his jacket there, but I don't mind. Those are meant to be dark. If anything, let's just drop that contrast a tiny bit. So there's before, there's after. Love how easy this camera is to edit. So we'll copy those settings, paste them here. So I want the scene to feel, I want the scene to feel a little bit more blue. So we might have to go into the HSL because that was all desaturated. Crank that sat, crank the luminance a bit, add some teal into here. Boom. Okay. So you can see the highlights on the little ice here. When it's in the original, you'd see it's like a little too bright, but with those settings that we have, you can see a little bit more detail on those. So I still want those to feel bright, so I'll bring the highlights down and the whiteness up. So you still get that like luminance value, but you see a little bit more detail in there. So love where that's at. So there's before, looks super clean, nice, evenly exposed. Then there's after. Love where that's at. Okay, so we're now at Convict Lake again. This was a fan favorite from you guys. We'll adjust the crop, but I guess if we're copying these settings, I'll have to readjust that crop anyways. So I want this to feel nice and bright and warm. I'm gonna bring that contrast down a little bit. We just adjusted the exposure and contrast and it's already in a much better spot. I think if anything, I'll just add a little bit of the blue back in and drop the orange a tiny bit just because those trees are a little too orange there. But damn, there's before, there's after. These files are just way too easy to edit. I love it. Got another one here. It's looking a little dark, but I know we can salvage it. But I think I want to go black and white on this one. And I want to go a different route than the other black and whites. I don't want it to be super crunchy and contrasty. I want this one to feel bright and light and smooth. So we're going to start off with our exposure, bring that up, contrast down, highlights down a tiny bit, shadows a little bit down, whites up, blacks down. That's like the Thomas classic. That's what I did for every photo way back in the day. Then we'll do this new S-curve. You can see like the shadows like in Nathan's feet against like the highlights there. Just really kind of brings it together a bit more. And then I want to add a little bit more grain. And then let's kind of fine tune this contrast here. Just a little bit more. And you can see up in the histogram here, these whites aren't completely white. They don't need to be. And that's the thing that you'll notice with a lot of people's work. The blacks and the whites aren't normally black and white. They kind of range in between the scale there, but if these things were completely white, it would look really bad. But so there's before. You can see it's a little underexposed. I tried to save the highlights there. And then after. It turns out great. Okay, for this one, I think... let's do Astia again. I keep doing Astia. So let's bring those highlights down just to save the outside there. We'll bring exposure down. Contrast, let's go all the way down just to kind of make both highlights and shadows a bit more even. If we brought contrast all the way up, it just separates it too much, but this brings it a little closer together. I already know I want to warm this up a bit more. And then to save the wall on the inside, let's just bring those orange and yellow hues down. I'm getting a little teal in the seats there. I want to bring that down too. This is a tricky one. But when I'm looking at it, when I see before and after, it's already looking so much better. Kind of want to bring the crop back out just to see what happens. With the blues in the sky, let's add some saturation and then bring the luminance down. I like where that's at. Okay, there's before, there's after. You can see just how like bad of an image this starts out to be, but then you can definitely salvage it. So that's the nice thing about shooting in RAW. All right, so this frame's probably different. Mike's in a different spot. I'm wearing a different hat. Lighting's probably a little off, but I just got back from surfing and I was about to start editing this project, and I looked through and I noticed that my screen recording froze basically at the end. It should be fine throughout the beginning of it, but at the end on these last two photos, it completely froze. So I just wanted to redo it real quick instead of just scrapping these, because I really do enjoy these photos. So with this one, let's copy our settings here. Let's go to the last photo, go to choose edit settings to copy, click none. We do crop, effects, detail, and optics. Paste that there and just paste that there so we can have the same foundation there. Okay, so for this, I want to focus in on the sunset. I think classic chrome, ASCII looks pretty good again. Let's drop the contrast, drop highlights, drop shadows. Exposure can go down as well. And we'll do our little tone curve here. Just bring those down. That's looking pretty good. With sunsets, I really enjoy having the sunset be warm. So I want to warm that up a bit, add a little bit more yellow and orange into the scene. And then for the blue clouds, I want to desat and then darken them a bit just to make it feel a little bit more dramatic. But that's a super quick edit. So here's before and here's after. With this, you gotta be able to see the ridge lines. They're all silhouetted, so you know they're there, but you're not seeing all the detail in them, but you're focused in on the sunset and just the glow coming in. You have the orange on the left and blue on the right, so you have the complementary colors there. Just really good color contrast, so really enjoy that image there. So for this one, I wanna do two different looks. I wanna do a grungy black and white and then do a color edit. So for this first one, let's do camera monochrome and then just go crazy with the contrast. We'll do that same tone curve here, go all the way down, add a little bit of texture, and then add some more grain. A little before and after there. You can see that you still have like the shadows and the highlights in here, but the values aren't like completely white. We're still maintaining all that detail there. You're not seeing any of the foreground, it's all lost in the shadows, but that's not the main focus here. Yeah, that's what I would do for a grungy black and white edit. So then for the color one, let's throw it on, I think Velvia looks really good here. And I want this to be kind of similar to the black and white one, where you're not seeing too much of that foreground. It's not really the main focus. Your main focus is the ridge line here. And this section of 395 is gorgeous because you have Mount Whitney just towering over, and it's just a stunning place. But I want this to be a little bit warmer just because it was sunrise. I want that light to feel a little more golden. But the mountains are looking a little bit too orange once we bumped up the temperature, so we'll just drop the saturation a bit on those. Go before and after there. I'm seeing a little bit of blue in the shadows, so maybe you can just desat that a tiny bit. Texture looks good, grain looks good, sharpening looks good. I think I'll just drop that contrast a bit more and the highlights a bit more. So yeah, there's before and there's after. And then you can see these two side by side, black and white in color. The great thing about these Fuji RAW files is that you can customize them to any look and any style that you please. You can favor it towards black and white and have it be grungy, or go artistic and pastel, or just do a classic like Portrait 400 look. You can do so many looks out of these. And the great thing about shooting in RAW is that you can duplicate them, so you can have multiple styles all in your catalog that you can choose from. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like down below if you did. If you have any questions about my workflow or my presets or just anything about these Fuji cameras, leave them down below. I'll try to get to all of them as well. And yeah, the X100V is such a fun camera to work with. It's made photography so much more fun for me after all these years. And honestly, I prefer the photos way more out of this camera than any other camera that I've worked with. But yeah, that's my process on how I edit my X100V photos, and I'll see you guys next week. Peace.